Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As you've been joining us with our program over the last 8 years, you've encountered many wonderful programs where we try to find ways that we can share with people to change lifestyle and perhaps one's habits and ways so that you can begin to manifest a particular lifestyle that you've always dreamed of. But why do we find that so hard to do, especially by this time? After all, you've encountered many habits that seem to be deeply rooted with the style and the way and the grace that you simply are. On the Beyond 50 radio program today, we're going to be talking with author Dr. Joe Dispenza. He is an expert on the brain, mind, and human potential. He's been studying the brain, in fact, for many decades. He was also featured in the award-winning film, What the Bleep Do We Know? And also the newest one, which is the film, The People versus the State of Illusion. We're going to be talking with him today about his book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. That is, how to lose your mind and create a new one. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dr. Joe Dispenza. Dr. Dispenza, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Daniel.
Now, we have covered this subject, especially over the last 3 or 4 years, when it comes to thought and how you change these things, and have had a lot of great guests on the program. Now, this book here is one that you pick up and you find it addicting to the point that you just can't put it down. You really know your stuff.
Well, thank you. I'm humbled.
Now, what led you in this direction with your life where you began to study the brain and how it functions over several decades?
Well, when I was in my 20s, I had the privilege of being run over by a truck in a triathlon and happened to break 6 vertebrae in my spine. One of the vertebrae was more than 60% compressed, and I had bone fragments on my spinal cord, and the prognosis wasn't looking too good. So there was a procedure, a radical Harrington rod surgery procedure, where they eliminate or surgically remove the back parts of the vertebrae and then screw long stainless steel rods into your spine. You know, the prognosis was if I didn't have the surgery, I'd probably never walk again. So this was a moment in my life where I had to decide if everything that I believed in from a spiritual or philosophical standpoint was actually true. I decided not to have the surgery, and that okay, if there's a spiritual essence within me, and that's giving me life, and it's both personal and universal, I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not doing anything, and I'm not living my life in a normal way. It basically went from 100 miles an hour to a dead stop. I said, well, let's see if I can make contact with this intelligence and begin to see if I can have it co-create significant changes within me. And so that began my journey, and quite nicely, within 10 weeks, I was back on my feet and back in my office and training again in 12 weeks, and it changed my life. And I just made a deal with myself that if I was ever able to walk again, that I'd spend the rest of my life studying this, and that was 1986. So that's where it all started.
Now, since you started in 1986, how have you seen, as far as the evolution of materials that are available out there for people, change?
Well, I think science has become the contemporary language of mysticism. I think science demystifies a lot of those concepts that were once considered intangible or immaterial.
Mm-hmm.
And the beauty about the latest research in neuroscience or quantum physics or neuroendocrinology or epigenetics, it's all pointing the finger to the same thing, and that is there's more to us than meets the eye, and that maybe the present models of the way we view things scientifically are just stepping stones to greater understandings. And so when you use science as a model to explain the nature of reality, the beauty behind it is that nobody is excluded from the equation. If you talk about tradition or culture or religion, the moment you begin to speak in those segregated terms, you start eliminating people. So I love science as the model to give people permission to explore it in their life. And so The research has been great. Some of the latest technology shows us that so many aspects of ourselves really are adaptable and changeable.
You know, I remember it was probably about 5 years ago. I was holding my granddaughter and walking her down the hallway of her grandmother's house. And she has a lot of pictures throughout this hallway of family members. And as I was walking, there were several people in the kitchen, and I said, I want to kind of have you take a look at this wall here of all these people so that you can come to understand that who you are is not entirely all your fault. Everybody seemed to think that was pretty funny. But when we take a look at the ideal of genetics, especially genes, there was an old school of thought which Dr. Bruce Lipton has done a wonderful job of proving, well, it's not just as set in stone as we used to believe, is that just even something like that, the power of a belief in science has really held in many ways us hostage from really evolving further. I mean, take a look at Newtonian physics, for instance. And then Einstein comes on the scene and he changes that. But it seems to take such a long period of time, I understand some 30 years sometimes, for a good new idea, I suppose, to really evolve to where people generally begin to accept it. That seems to be quite a lot of, time for a change to happen where it can really hold people back.
Well, the concept of epigenetics and the concept of neuroplasticity really is an amazing paradox because, as recent as 30 years ago, whether you're talking about brain changes or genetic changes, the research was done studying rodents and animals that were in an unchanging environment. Mm-hmm. So if you take a group of rats or rodents or any mammal and those mammals are every day doing the same things, going to the same places, interacting with other species of the same animal, climate isn't changing, everything's controlled, well then we know for a fact that the brain will never change because the brain only upscales its hardware based on learning new things and having new experiences. Mm-hmm. By the same means, if you're looking at the genetic expression of those animals, the experience produces an emotion, and the emotion is the signal chemically that begins to activate different genes. And we now know that you can express up to 2,000 different variations on the same gene without changing the gene, which is kind of a mind-boggling concept. So if you're studying rodents and animals in an unchanging environment, then you will see no brain changes and no genetic changes. And then it begs the question then, well, if you look at human beings, if they're reaching a certain point in their life where they're above 35 years old, where there are a set of memorized behaviors and emotional reactions, beliefs and perceptions that are happening subconsciously, then in fact they're going to the same place of work, doing the same things, seeing the same people that push the same emotional buttons, getting out of bed the same way, brushing your teeth with the same hand. There's no new information coming into the environment, and by the time we're 35 years old, we could say that we can predict the feeling or the emotion of any experience. And this is a really difficult moment because if you can't predict the feeling of something, most people won't try it out because, the unknown all of a sudden gets excluded. So now all we're left with is our genetic destiny, and now the gene tends to be the dominant agent that allows us to live in those conventional models. So you learn new things, you have new experiences, you embrace new opportunities, you make different choices. All of a sudden, there's a reorganization that takes place in the brain and body.
Neurobiology especially has become, as you were mentioning earlier in the program, one of those things that science has been able to take and demystify for many common people to begin to understand this is how this is. Now, do you think that the mind truly wants to be understood?
Well, it depends on what part of the mind.
I just found that to be an interesting question to ask even as you were speaking earlier in the program. I thought, I wonder if this is what the Zen monks were talking about, seeing the ox's tail, for instance.
It's a great question because I think that if you're studying subjective mind, either you're studying it like, say, neurologically or neurobiologically in the brain. If you're thinking the same thoughts, if you're performing the same actions, if you're living by the same emotions, without a fact, your brain will not change because nerve cells that fire together wire together.
Mm-hmm.
So as you keep revisiting those same states of mind and body, the brain fires in the same sequence, in the same pattern, and in the same combination. And when that happens over and over again, the brain begins to fire in very finite patterns, that kind of box of the brain. There's no box in your brain, but it's the most commonly fired neurologically wired patterns of thought, behavior, and emotion. And we call that finite signature personality or an identity. So then to change the mind then is to cause the brain to fire in new and unique ways. And the one ingredient that does that is knowledge or information, because every time we learn something new, we make a new synaptic connection in the brain. That's what learning is. Learning is forging new circuits. Remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. So as you begin to make a new stitch in the three-dimensional tapestry of your gray matter, you're adding raw materials then to cause you to contemplate new ideas. And when you do that, that contemplation or self-reflection process is the building process neurologically in the brain. But most people, though, they reach a certain point where they stop learning and they start feeling. That's the point where the personality begins to become pretty finite.
Mm-hmm. Now, you described that by the age of 35, people really begin to be set. But that isn't a permanent condition, and if people could come to understand, especially as they see in your book, Breaking the Habit of Being You, it may not seem easy at first, but it's very doable.
Sure. Well, what we know from the psychological model is that age of 35 is pretty much where things tend to get really memorized in the body.
Mm-hmm.
Where we've done it so many times, we don't have to think about it any longer. You get in your car, you put the seat a certain way, you turn the key, you put your seatbelt on, you put it in reverse. Most people aren't thinking about those behaviors that they had to consciously learn in the beginning. But as we begin to continue in our life and we begin to navigate through the environment, we experience much of what life has to offer. So I always use this example. It's that type of memory where it becomes a habit is called non-declarative memory. You've done it so many times, you can't even declare how you do it. You know how to do it, but you don't even know how you know how. And, you can walk up to a phone and not consciously remember a phone number. Of course, you'd have to be over 35 for this. But you can then pick up the receiver and your fingers can dial the number. You couldn't consciously remember it, but you practiced it so many times that your body knew as well as your brain. Now, 95% of who we are sits in that type of subconscious programming in which the body knows as well as the mind. So a person then wants to change, and they're using 5% of their conscious mind to work against 95% of what they've memorized. So, in essence, we have mind and body in opposition. When we change, true change requires going into the operating system where those programs exist and begin to reorganize the circuitry neurologically and signal the body emotionally into a new state of being. And so it requires then getting into the subconscious programs and begins to make measurable changes there. That's when change happens.
Now, when I had the opportunity to see the opening of What the Bleep Do We Know, and fascinatingly enough, got to enjoy it at the Baghdad Theater, which, as anybody well knows, that's pretty much where the movie begins and ends.
Yes.
I thought, boy, this is pretty wild going into a theater where it starts and finishes. Anyway, but as it was finished, I had actually been reading quite a bit about physics, starting off with like the works of Fritjof-Capra, for instance. And everybody, you could just hear the conversation when it was finished. People were beginning to feel the essence of, geez, I can create my own reality. I'm excited about this. I've been given the magic wand. I can't wait to get out there and take over the world. And I kind of felt a little smile rise in me, because when it comes to change, unless you really can have a good feeling of why, sometimes it's not so easy. It becomes pretty difficult. So I've started remembering the scene from the movie Forrest Gump, where everybody all of a sudden was running with him, and then he just stops, and then he just decided to go do something else, and everybody was frustrated. Well, now what are we supposed to go do? You know, I kind of felt like this crowd after this movie must have felt the same way about a week later.
Well, you know, the movie, we did the movie, and we did it on two levels.
Mm-hmm.
One, to present a question about the nature of reality, and I think it was a good first attempt to open doors of perception. But secondly, give people permission really to try it out, to see
Sure.
their subjective mind in some way, shape, or form can produce results in the objective world. Now, that's the quantum model of reality. But here's the problem. Your personality creates your personal reality.
Mm-hmm.
Personality is made up of how you think, how you act, and how you feel. Then the present person in this show has created the present personal reality called their life. Which means then, if you want to create a new personal reality, then on a fundamental level, you have to change the thoughts you think, the behaviors that you demonstrate, and the emotions that you live by. And I think most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality. And it doesn't work because essentially it means you're thinking the same thoughts, performing the same actions, and living by the same emotions, but secretly expecting something to change in your life.
Mm-hmm. Now, to think about how incredible what you're talking about is, let's first take a look at the subconscious versus the conscious mind. Now, tell us first of all, how much information does the subconscious mind take in versus the conscious mind?
Well, the conscious mind, I'll just give you the neurological understanding, and then we can go into bits of information. But we have about probably between 5,000 and 40,000 connections in our thinking neocortex conscious brain. Now, the subconscious, as an example, the cerebellum, which sits at the back of the brain there, has between 100,000 and some areas up to 1 million circuits or connections. So it's processing billions of bits of information every single second. And those billions of bits of information are happening below our conscious awareness. So when a person then is interacting in their life, they're engaging in their external environment, the brain is picking up, information about sitting in a chair, how much pain you have, if you're hungry, if you're watching television, if you're reading a book. The brain is trying to create meaning or coherence between the external world and the internal world. That's what it does. But those subconscious functions that are taking place in keeping your heart beating and digesting your food and regulating 66 functions in your liver and probably over trillions of functions in one cell per second, you're looking at a vast, vast supercomputer that's, pretty much an information processor. So it's the subconscious that hooks us up to the quantum field, and the quantum field is a limitless field of information. So it begins to give life to the expression of who we are. So billions of bits of information compared to just 2,000 bits in the conscious mind.
Mm-hmm. Now, the conscious mind, as I come to understand in your book, is one that manages these billions of bits of information in a cohesive way that you're able to take action with. Now, you can see how, for instance, when a person decides, my life just isn't working out well, I would like to have better this or experience a different that, I'm going to go ahead and put it in action. So the first thing that I do is I catch the best title of a book that I can find on a shelf showing me a set of secrets, ideas, or magic ways that things will lead me to the promised land. I will dive into it. I will do the exercises. Then how come 20 or 30 days later, perhaps 2 months later, maybe even a year later, things just aren't any different than they were before? And as you talk about in here in the book, first of all, your brain is very efficient at what it does. In fact, it's an efficiency expert. It wants to burn as little energy as possible because, after all, it has a lot of responsibility just maintaining the body and all of its systems. So what it does is it sets in motion all of those systems in such a way for efficiency. When it comes to change, you talk about the biochemistry of the body, how the individual cells create or actually have their own little intelligences or brains to all work together. So when you come to have change, it stands to reason people actually begin, when real change happens, to feel a little bit of a nervous breakdown, if you will. Describe that.
Well, I call that literally losing your mind. That's because, when we have a thought, every time we have a thought, we make a chemical. If you have a great thought or a joyful thought, you turn on a set of circuits in your brain in a specific sequence, pattern, and combination that produces a level of mind that turns on another part of the brain that makes a chemical for us to feel exactly the way we were just thinking, great or joyful. Same is true if you have an unhappy or negative thought. Now, the moment you begin to feel the way you think, because the brain is in constant communication with the body, you begin to think the way you feel. And so some people get caught in this cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking for years on end. And that cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking creates what I call a state of being. So then the state of being is a fixed level of chemical continuity that the person has become familiar with. Now, in the midst of change, when we declare we're no longer going to think this way or behave this way or choose this way to experience a certain event that produces a certain emotion, the moment we begin to break that chemical continuity, it all of a sudden becomes unfamiliar to us, discomforting, because that irregular cycle now that's been disrupted begins to challenge our identity. The redundancy of living in that cycle conditions the body to memorize those emotions as well as the conscious mind. So now, the body, the servant, has become the master. So when we're in the midst of change, all of a sudden, the body who's modified its receptor sites to a certain state of being that's equal to the emotional states of the person that they've memorized from the past is pretty much a fixed level. And as we begin to break that state, the body begins to send signals back to the brain, subconsciously trying to force it to return back to the same state it's been trained to live by. And all of a sudden, people start to hear this chatter in their head, or these voices that start saying, start tomorrow, this isn't a good idea, this doesn't feel like, you're too much like your mother.
Right.
All of that is the body trying to seduce the brain into returning back to the same state of being. And when we respond to that chatter, consciousness immerses itself right back in the program, and we return back to thinking the same way, acting the same way, and feeling the same way. So to change, then, is to think greater than the feelings of our body, to think greater than the body, and that's an act of will. And that's where people step outside those familiar emotions, and now they can't predict the feeling of what's going to happen next. So they return back to the same relationship, the same difficult situation in their job, the same reality. At least they can feel something, because God forbid they can't feel anything.
Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating when you think of people who, for instance, want to challenge themselves to personal growth. One industry that's out there would be, for instance, the director network marketing industry. So people see this opportunity, they're lured in generally into something where it promises freedom from a job, time freedom, and perhaps abundance and wealth. So they get into these programs and they get moving along after a couple of months, and generally they fade away because it requires a lot of personal transformation. And I can tell you, and I'm sure you understood this as well, anybody who's ever decided to go from being an employee where you go and you work for somebody, get a paycheck, to go on and start your own business, there's quite a bit of personal transformation that really happens. And it's fascinating how I think when people start businesses, they think automatically, this should replace and actually increase my income. And after the first year to 5 years, that just isn't necessarily true because of the personal changes that are really required for you to be successful.
Well, that's an interesting concept because we have been conditioned into believing this sort of Pollyanna, media-based Hollywood idea that, it only takes a moment because we live in a convenient society where We're consumers, and we demand things with a sense of entitlement that it should happen right away. I mean, if your internet connection doesn't come up within 10 seconds, for most people, something's really wrong. So we've become really impatient as a culture. And so people, when they start moving into those states where they're out of their comfort zone, if it doesn't happen immediately, then the very change in their chemistry, neurologically and biologically, begins to upset them. And all of a sudden, they start turning on those hormones of stress that now force them to really react to the conditions in their life and enhance their impatience and cause them to try to push the outcome, force the outcome, try to control the outcome. And that's not the state of being that really true change and true growth and mastery take place from. So we live in this level of impatience because that we want that discomfort to go away right away. But what most people don't know is that if they can maintain that level of discomfort, all of a sudden that discomfort begins to resolve itself because the body breaks free from the addictions of the emotions that kept them caught in the same life.
And that's such a fascinating way to look at it, for instance, as you say, the Hollywood Pollyanna way of doing things now. We all come to know as we get older and we begin to approach and read and study about how the brain works so that we can learn to not only manage our behaviors but also improve our lives, is that one of the first things we begin to understand, well, gee whiz, a lot of who I am started back in childhood, perhaps, even further while I was still in the womb, for instance, just gathering this information on a subconscious level and storing it. The truth also, though, is a little bit stranger than I think a lot of our listeners might think when it comes to, since we're gathering so much information so quickly, that we are even kind of subliminally grabbing things that we may not be aware of. And when you take a look at today's world, it's noisy, it's full of advertising. It seems like every other car, has a company with a phone number that you need to call, that it creates a perpetual level of anxiety that gets really difficult to manage. So you begin to see realities, for instance, in such ways that you feel that you actually have this need to improve who you are because who you are just isn't good enough. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I talk about that concept in a certain chapter of the book where I talk about the gap. We have this kind of gap that we live by in how we appear to the world and who we really are on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
The appear to the world is how we identify with everything in our external environment. The people we know, the clothes we wear, the things we do, the cars we drive, the places we go, the experiences we've had in our life at different times. That is the identity that's really neurologically connected to the environment. And
by the way, for the listeners out there, Dr. Joe shares his very own experience about being the authentic you.
Well, that's the only way we learn, yeah? And then, how we appear inside is the emotions that we feel that, for the most part, we can distract ourselves from feeling by keeping our attention on the external world. And that works really well for a good part of our life, and all of a sudden, we realize that nothing is making that feeling go away because, once again, we've experienced much of what life has to offer, and we can predict how everything's going to feel. So this is the midlife crisis. This is where everybody either looks down at that feeling and begins to tell the truth about who they are, or they go further into the environment. This is where the media and television and advertising, buy this product, it'll make you feel this way. Everything's in, the person buys the sports car or, buys the boat or, joins a new social club to meet new people or goes on vacation to a new place. But when the novelty of all of that wears off, the person returns back to the same feeling. So critical point in our life where we have to make a decision, either that true joy and true happiness begins to be cultivated from within us, because as we begin to unmemorize those emotions, that are connected to our past, and we begin to transmute them into something else, then we'll always be reliant on the external environment. And I think, corporations know this really well, and your identity, or our identity, has nothing to do with that. Our true identity, the essence of who we are, transcends our body, transcends the environment, and literally transcends time.
And I think what's marvelous in how you lay it out in your book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, is that a lot of times we tend to operate from our past experiences. You go to a carnival, like you said, you can pretty much kind of predict what the outcome is. So when somebody says, let's go to a carnival, let's bring the kids, you pretty much look at this and say, well, I've done this before. You can only have so many hot dogs, cotton candy, and spins on the Ferris wheel, for instance. So that just doesn't sound very exciting for me. You've already predicted that future from a past experience, but you've taken away the true miracle of the moment of just going with it to see what will happen. And truly, the miracle is in the moment, as you describe. And it's one thing when people can understand this, but it's another thing when you come to know this.
Well, and I think you've struck the nail right on the head, because all of these concepts, all of this information is philosophy, it's dinner conversation, it's great concepts to stimulate the mind, but where it gets really, really, really exciting is when you work with yourself, your work in progress of self, to actually apply it and personalize it and demonstrate it. And when you do, and you actually put the principles to use, you will have a new experience, and the new experience will create a new emotion. And that new emotion is new information coming to your cells, and now you're literally rewriting the program neurologically, genetically, biologically, and you're beginning now to evolve out of your old state of being.
I remember reading that, for instance, when it comes to the brain, that, and I found this kind of interesting, that if you don't give the brain problems to solve, then it's going to give them for you. What has been your experience with that, if any?
I like that a lot.
Because there's actually a lot of truth to it. If you're going to be complacent and sedentary, and you're going to want things to be as they are, isn't it interesting how chaos or some kind of crisis comes along that shakes your tree?
No, that's really, one of my central messages is that most people wait for crisis or trauma or disease or diagnosis or loss, to get about some type of change in their life. We have to reach our lowest denominator, where we finally say, I can't go on any longer. I can't live the same way. I can't do this any longer. And when we reach that point, we're basically saying, first of all, I don't know anymore, and I don't want to think the same way. I don't want to act the same way. I don't want to feel this way any longer. And we begin to observe for the first time who we're really being and beginning to make choices with firm intention to no longer be that individual. Now, my message is why wait? Why wait for crisis to change? I think we can learn and change in a state of pain and suffering, or we can learn and change in a state of joy or inspiration. And that means then that you can't sit back in that complacent state and expect your life to change in some way without you learning new things or making different choices or creating new experiences. And that's just human nature. I mean, look at our current world right now. I think every paradigm and every system is breaking down. The political model, economic model, medical model, the religious model, the environment, educational model, it's all falling apart because we have to reach this point where something else can begin to reorganize itself. So I think it's the same with most human beings. So I hope that in the book I inspire people to not wait for that point, to actually get about it before that point hits.
Now, if you can, for our listeners, tell us how, as you began this journey back in the mid-1980s to the point that you are now. I mean, it's obvious people see that you're, with an award-winning movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? I'm sure People versus the State of Illusion is going to be quite interesting. and if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit later in the program what that is a little bit about. But how has all of this changed you and how you engage in life now? And what is life? How has it responded to you as far as that change is concerned?
Okay, I'll answer it, Daniel, in two ways. After I got on my feet after my injury,
Mm-hmm.
And was really intrigued about this whole concept of health and mind-body connection, I took somewhat of a spiritual path and left Southern California, and along the way, I decided to study people that were diagnosed with, aggressive diseases and see what happened in what's so-called spontaneous remissions, is the medical term, how they all of a sudden got better. And so I traveled to many different countries and studied people with all kinds of health conditions, and they were treating both conventionally and non-conventionally, and they were either staying the same or getting worse. But all of a sudden, after a certain period of time, they just spontaneously started getting better. So something happens once in science that's called an incident. When you have two events that happen that are within a very similar time frame that have certain criteria, that's called a coincidence. And it starts happening 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 times. Now you're looking at a trend. And anything that has a trend or a pattern is science. It's reproducible. So I studied these people and found out that they had 4 common elements that allowed them to go into remission. I call it a quantum healing. And I kind of organized the data and went over the 4 common elements. And then, wrote my first book, Evolve Your Brain. And then people said, God, that's a lot of good information in the book, but how do we do it?
How do we do it?
So I started teaching workshops pretty much around the world, and I show people exactly what I do in my own personal, practices. And it was really a great moment because I think this is a time in history where people just don't want to know, they want to know how.
Right.
And in the last 5 years or so, based on the workshops we've done, we've had people heal themselves of MS, many people, cancer, diabetes, chronic pain, thyroid conditions like Hashimoto syndrome, lupus. We've had really substantial changes that we've observed in the work that we've been doing, and it's really an amazing concept because now my whole interest was to actually make it a scientific law. So I had my own personal experience, then I studied the spontaneous remissions, found out the common elements, and then I said we should be able to reproduce this. And I'm happy to say that at this point in the work that we're doing is that we're seeing measurable changes in people's life and health because now we've hopefully demystified it to some degree. So that's presently where I'm at right now. And Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, the book, is really the companion book to my first book because it tells people actually how to do it, how to begin to make those changes. Now, on a personal level, my interest really is to put into practice the same exact concepts and really be the living example of everything that I teach, in different places around the world because when I'm engaged in the process of change and when I'm involved in my own personal journey, and I understand what it takes to change, it keeps me humble and it keeps me sincere, and it doesn't just keep it within the realm of science. It becomes very practical, and I think, being practical and applying this is really what people want more than anything else. So I do my best to walk my talk.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating work here. For those of you who just joined us, we're talking with Dr. Joe Dispenza. His book is Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. And it's such a wonderful habit to break because, who doesn't want new experiences? It gives you a buzz at night. In fact, many times throughout this particular program, Beyond 50, is that we have actually, through neuroscientists, talked about addiction. For instance, alcohol is considered a disease, alcoholism. But many people that I've been talking with, they say, No, that's an old modality that's a lot of nonsense, and as you take a look at what you talk about, how your brain sets up the neurochemical activity throughout the whole body, you realize, maybe there's some truth to the fact that it isn't that, it's that we're addicted to an emotion of, for instance, you take a drug or you have alcohol or perhaps it's sex or perhaps you like to go out and steal, that there's really a true emotion that you're addicted to that causes you to do these things because the natural way of doing them gets to a point that it becomes numb, so you need to heighten it. It's sort of like that addiction, you get used to it, for instance, with alcohol, one drink used to do the trick and now you're up to a half of a case. And it just keeps elevating, and we all know that, the more alcohol you drink, the worse it's going to get for you physiologically. So it's interesting how a lot of this, I think, over the last 10 plus years has really begun to change old modalities of thinking when it comes to, for instance, addiction, to where people feel that it's possible to actually change that and feel better without having to use anything.
Well, that's exactly, I think, what people are looking for right now. And, when in the chapter where I talk about the gap, that first level and that kind of midlife crisis to try to make the feeling go away inside of us, buying a sports car, getting a facelift, or going on vacation, or buying new clothes, all of that is to try to create a new identity. It's a really innate desire to change, but most of us think that change has to happen by changing something outside of us and not within us. And as I said, when the novelty and newness of all those things wear off and the feeling keeps coming back, this is where people start going to the next level. This is where they start using drugs or alcohol or overeating or undereating or shopping or pornography or video gambling or gambling. All of these addictions are because the moment the person takes a drug or takes a drink or shops, they notice that feeling goes away inside of them. Now, the moment they notice that emotion or feeling go away inside of them, there's a change in their internal chemistry. They pay attention to whatever it was outside of them or whoever it was outside of them that caused that. And that event in and of itself is called an associative memory, and it's subconscious. So now, here's the problem. The next time the person shops or the next time the person takes a drug, the receptor sites on the outside of the cells just got a huge rush of chemicals, and those receptor sites become desensitized. So the next time they shop or the next time they use a drug, they have to take a little bit more, turn on the cell to make the feeling go away. And in effect, it begins to cause the pleasure centers in the brain to recalibrate to a higher level, so it always requires more. Now that's an addiction. So then in the absence of that chemical dependency, the person can't find pleasure, or pleasure is the best word to use, to make the feeling go away, from anything else in their life. Sunset, walking the dog, visiting an elder, none of that produces any joy because their pleasure centers are so hijacked to such a high level that in the absence of those substances or those actions, they feel an immense amount of emptiness. And this is where the addiction begins to become very real, because all of that attempting of changing their internal state is that innate desire to make a feeling go away and be better. But really, we could say then behind every addiction, there's some type of emotion that people have memorized or become addicted to. So then true change then is when you begin to look at those emotions and transmute those emotions into something greater, because when that emotion is changed, then there really is no need to use a substance outside of you, because now you're happy, you're feeling joy without anything. And I think one of the issues really is that the nomenclature, because people confuse pleasure with joy. They're two separate, completely different things. Pleasure is, using something to stimulate you to make you feel good. Joy is when you're happy for no reason, because you're peaceful, or you're at a poised place within you that has nothing to do with anything outside of you.
Now, there's a nice contrast that we can use when it comes to this law of attraction that everybody loves to tout, and then they get frustrated. Well, gee whiz, I'm doing all these things and it just isn't working for me too well. And as I like to suggest to people when they feel that bit of frustration, oh, the law of attraction's working all right. You just have to pay attention to what it is you've been attracting. Trust me, it's working. Now isn't that funny? Yeah, you attracted that truck that just ran you down on the road. You did that.
Well, but really, in essence, if you think about it, you could create the most amazing vision board and, get very clear on the new house, the new SUV, and the groomed dog, and whatever people want. But if that is where your conscious mind is, you're feeling unworthy. That's mind and body in opposition. If you're praying for a new life and you're feeling guilty, that's mind and body in opposition. If you're thinking positively but you're feeling negatively, that's mind and body in opposition. You have to get mind and body working together. You have to recondition the body to a new mind. And when mind and body are working together, you're in a new state of being. And the universe responds to who we're being, because a state of being is a new personality. And a new personality creates a new personal reality. So people misinterpret the law of attraction, because if they're feeling guilty, then thought sends the signal out, but feeling draws the event back. They're drawing to them events in their life equal to that feeling. So the true message is that when people think, oh, when I get this new car, or when I get the new home, then I'll be happy. That's the reverse message. You have to give thanks before the event, so much so that your body, as the unconscious mind, begins to believe that the future reality is happening to you in the present moment. And when that happens, the body, as the unconscious mind, begins to genetically change ahead of the actual event. So you're physically changing, and that means that the event has already happened, because gratitude is the emotional signature that the event is already done. And I think we've been hypnotized and conditioned into believing that we need a reason for joy, we need a reason for gratitude. That's the Newtonian model you were talking about. The quantum model says you have to give thanks ahead of the actual event, and you have to move into that state of being, because if you're relying on your senses should be the last to experience what your mind has created. But when we live by Newtonian laws, we're living by our senses. The quantum law is nonsense. It's beyond the senses.
Fascinating stuff here, I'll tell you. I was just recently watching an episode of Dallas, the original series, and little Lucy was dating this guy who was aspiring to become a doctor. And, of course, she's somebody who was raised in money and privilege. And here this guy is struggling in medical school. And it was at a point of frustration where he was talking with a friend of his, and she was consoling him, trying to make him feel better. I can't remember really the details of it. But what was powerful, especially after you read a book like yours, is you begin to look around you at examples that really help nurture you into the direction that you're talking about here. And what he had said is, it just seems like for her life, everything just comes easy. In my life, I was always led to believe that you can't really enjoy something unless you'll work hard for it. The truth is, though, when it comes to manifestation of dreams and whatever else you want in your life, when you begin to really apply what you're suggesting and talking about here, that things really do kind of become very easy, that it doesn't have to be hard work. My guess is, if it's hard work, then you're looking to change something inside of you from the outside. Would you say that would be a fair way to look at this?
Yeah, I think it's a very good way to look at it. And really, a belief is a thought we keep thinking over and over again, right? So it becomes neurologically wired in our brain. And then it's also an emotion that we keep revisiting based on a past experience. So if a belief then is related to the mind and body like that, because thoughts are the language of the brain and feelings are the language of the body, then a belief is a state of being. So state of being is our personality. So our beliefs become our personality. So if we believe that we have to work hard for something, that subconscious state of being is literally how we navigate through our life, because it's become so part of our associative memories that it's who we believe we are. So the true change then, the true message, and we were talking about this at a workshop I just did this past weekend. You have to then understand that in order to change a belief, you're going to have to confront your very personality. And you have to change the belief with a energy or an emotion that's greater than the emotion of the addiction that's kept it the way it's been for all these years. So how can a person move into a state of religious ecstasy and chew on glass? Move into a different belief system in that moment that overwrites their neurocircuitry and their biology. That energy is transcended their physical state.
I don't know why I just had this image of the Flintstones. And this was an episode I'd love to see again, but there was a moment that I can only just remember the moment where Fred Flintstone is standing there and he's looking in the mirror. Apparently his, best friends and his wife and perhaps even his boss were getting on him about something. And so the episode, he's standing there in front of the mirror and his mirror reflection says to him, "I'll bet you can't live 24 hours with yourself." And I just thought to myself, if people could separate themselves, what they really are on the inside to the outside, and they had to live with that person for 24 hours, I'll bet you would want to change.
Right. And it's really funny because sometimes I wind up on talk shows or other radio shows, and I was in Australia, and I kept getting asked the same question. Well, how do we create,
Dr. Joe got caught in a rut.
How do I create my soulmate? How do I create,
right.
a great relationship? And, I got so tired of answering the question, I said, well, let me ask you a question. Seriously, would you go out with you? Would you live with you?
Right.
Yes. Then you should be ready for a relationship. If the answer is no, work on those things that you wouldn't want to live with in a person just like you.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating stuff. Now, back to, as we're wrapping up the show here, you talked about pleasure versus joy. Now, this is really an interesting contrast here because when you talk about manifesting the intentions that you want, the things you'd like to see in your life, when you do it for pleasure, obviously, it sounds like you said, we're looking to the outside for something to bring us that pleasure so that we feel good. And a lot of times that is hard work. And when we come from joy, we're just basically already happy about everything, it seems like. So we start to think, geez, that would be kind of nice to have in my life. And then all of a sudden it just appears. I think it's a wonderful place when you face daily miracles that come to you because then they begin to broaden the mystery of life. Where's this going to lead me next? And you're not forcing things anymore. And that's such a base premise of what the Eastern mystics tend to talk quite a bit about.
Yeah, well, I know that experience and from my understanding of the chemistry of stress, when we're living in stress, we're living in survival. And when we live in survival, our brain and body are knocked out of balance, and we feel separate from possibility because we live as materialists with all of our attention on our body, our environment, and on time. And this kind of state really is an illusory state because we spend the majority of our time trying to force and push things and make them happen because that's what those chemicals do. In the elegant state of creation, when we feel connected to something greater, we no longer feel separate and we're beyond our body. We're no longer using the evidence in our environment to determine our reality, and we're really beyond time.
Mm-hmm.
At that moment, we've really abandoned the old identity. And now we trust in the outcome. We trust in the unseen without evidence. And I call that the natural state of being. Now, getting there is the art. Getting there is what takes the practice.
Now, I believe that it was your daughter that wanted to go overseas, and that's where you start getting into the exercises that people begin to do, and you find yourself, for the listeners out there, as you're reading Breaking the Habit of Being You, you're beginning to just tear the pages up. You can't wait to get to the exercises, but at the same time, you did such a good job at writing this book that you feel that if you just jump to the back, that you're about to miss something.
Well,
So I'll give you that, definitely. That was really great work on your part.
well, knowledge is the precursor to experience, and you can jump to the back of the book, but just like so many forms of meditation and inward contemplative practices, you don't understand what you're doing, you have no intention behind it. So the first part of the book was really to give people the necessary knowledge and understanding scientifically and philosophically, so that when they got to the exercise, they knew exactly what they were doing and why. So nothing was left up to conjecture, nothing was left to dogma or speculation, based on just the sound information.
Now, tell us briefly, if you can, what is this new movie, People versus the State of Illusion?
Well, People versus the State of Illusion is very similar to the genre of What the Bleep, and it was designed really by a wonderful man named Austin Vickers. About 6 different researchers and scientific commentators, with a storyline that runs along that shows pretty much a guy who makes some tough choices and winds up in prison, and the prison's walls represent the prison of his own mind. How he has to transform himself to his own personal freedom. And so as the story goes on, we give information about the brain and the body and genes and circuitry and how change and transformation is actually possible. So the movie's become a pretty nice, it's gained a lot of momentum, and there's been a lot of great feedback from it, and nice comments pretty much around the country right now. It's been picked up by Metro-Goldwyn, and I just watched it for the second time when it was playing in Seattle, because I did a Q&A at the end of the movie, and just remembered how nice of a job Austin Vickers had done.
Now, in leaving for our listeners, what would be one exercise you could give to our listeners right now that they could begin to implement, to begin to, I guess, embrace what you talk about, besides going out and getting the book, Breaking the Habit of Being You, that they could take away right now to begin to implement?
One thing really simple. When you wake up in the morning, ask yourself this simple question: what is the greatest expression of myself that I can be today? What is the greatest ideal of myself? And remind yourself how you don't want to think any longer, how you no longer want to act, and how you no longer want to feel. And the ability for you to become conscious of those unconscious states of mind and body begins to objectify your old subjective self. As you observe who you're being, it means you're no longer the program. And when you can become that conscious of it, then you would never let any thought, behavior, or emotion slip by unconsciously in your day that would cause you to return back to the old self. And then you have to say, what is the new expression of myself? Let me remind myself how a great person would think, how a loving person would act, how a free person would feel. And if you said to yourself, I'm not getting up until I am this person, then what you're saying then is you are reconditioning your body to a new mind emotionally, so much so that your body begins to live in that future now. And if you can maintain that modified state of mind and body your entire day, hang on, because something unusual in your life is going to show up. That's the law.
Fascinating stuff. The book is Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. It's how to lose your mind and create a new one. Our wonderful guest, Dr. Joe Dispenza. What is your website? People can find out more.
It's just drjoedispenza.com, drjoedispenza.com.
Thank you for taking the time to be on the Beyond 50 radio program. Look forward to it. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Keep up the great work.
You too as well. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Go to our website at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50. We'll have a hot link there where you can visit Dr. Joe Dispenza's website to find out how you can break the habit of being yourself. Be sure also to visit our blog. We'll have an archive of the show for you to download and listen at your convenience, as well as share with others. I'm Daniel Davis. This is Beyond 50, and remember, live your day fast.